It's been fantastic, choice of talks today, because they all talk about different things that I'm going to talk about, so they just made the way for me so that I don't have to go into much detail and explain again some of these issues. And you'll also see that you're already familiar with the inscriptions that you're going to see today, because they were in the talk, but I will look at them from a kind of very different perspective, because I want to focus on the individuals behind these inscriptions. And well, as a member of the Cruz project, I focus my work on the earliest samples of alphabetic Greek. And as you may have noticed today, the study of the earliest inscriptions has shaped the way we understand the reasons why alphabetic Greek writing was created and used. In the studies concerning the birth of this writing system, philologists, archaeologists, and cultural historians have worked with exactly the same material, but arrived at very different conclusions on this matter. One of the main methodologies used to answer questions like where, when, how, and why was the Greek alphabet created has been the analysis of the earliest inscriptions, approaching them from these very different disciplines. Although they were aware of each other's work, in the end, one's own methodology prevailed, and there was not that much multidisciplinarity in their approaches. I will start the talk by presenting one of these studies, Barry Powell's study, of course, which is conducted from a philological point of view. And then I will propose a new interpretation for the material included in that study from quite a different perspective, using identifying inscriptions from the 8th and 7th centuries BC as a case study. And well, even though I would consider myself a philologist as well, if I have to choose one side of the debate, in this talk I would like to suggest a combination of epigraphic, linguistic, and archaeological evidence that will hopefully show how the combination of methodologies can help us understand better both the social context and the linguistic elements that interact with inscribed objects and their texts. I believe that this multidisciplinary view, which is the basis of our Cruz project, will take us closer to a better understanding of writing systems and the writing practices attached to them. So let me show you, let's talk again, rather, about the analysis of alphabetic Greek inscription that Barry Powell made. So in his very famous book already, and also other publications about the origins of the Greek alphabet, Powell gathered a reasonable amount of inscriptions, starting from the Diplomenokoe, which is dated around the middle of the 8th century BC, and going up to the end of the Orientalizing period in 650 BC. He took this evidence and analyzed it from a philological point of view, dividing the corpus in long and short inscriptions. His main argument is that the long inscriptions are enough evidence to support Vadigary's theory that the Greek alphabet was devised to write down epic poetry, since those inscriptions that he considered long are written in verse. The short inscriptions, on the other hand, are just fragmented or bear only names or simpler formulas, so he interprets them as simplified versions of the evidence that really matters to his argument, which are the long inscriptions. After concluded that the recording of poetry is the original and basic use of the Greek alphabet, he goes on to explain one of the biggest mysteries in the adaptation of the Phoenician alphabet to Greek. The creation and systematic use by Greeks of letters to write down vowels when Phoenician only wrote down consonants. In his line of argument, this is because of the moraic nature of the Greek verse, which is based on the length of the syllables that is often, though not always, marked by the short or long nature of the vocalic element of the syllables. You will see during this presentation that in fact Greek writing is very bad at this, and that I keep marking in the transcriptions of the text the long vowels because archaic Greek does not show the difference in many occasions. Apart from this, the flaws in Powell's arguments are plentiful, and there's not enough time today to consider them all. But nevertheless, his publications have proved to be of an enormous value to this specific academic field, for they invited numerous scholars from different disciplines to publish their reactions, which have been in fact vital to the progress of the field. Not to mention that almost 20 years after the publication of this book, we're still reacting to it. It is true that from a philological point of view, most of these inscriptions share the meter and some epic elements in their text. But if we look deeper into them, it is possible to see some elements that they are sharing with the prosaic short inscriptions left aside by Powell. We see that formulas are repeated and that these formulas are devised to introduce personal names. Personal names of real, individual, previously anonymous, that are being identified in this text. And this particular approach suggests that there's much more to these inscriptions than Powell thought. In what remains of this paper, I will take these identifying inscriptions as a case study, and I would like to propose a different way to look at them by focusing on the relationship between the inscribed object and the individual, and the role of writing in this specific kind of text. So I took from a database of inscriptions of my own, which gathers information about all Greek inscriptions in the 8th and 7th centuries BC, the data concerning the earliest identifying texts. As you can see, these conform 1/3 of the total of inscriptions in these 2 centuries. Another third cannot really be categorized because of the bad conditions of the texts, and the last third are a mix of other kinds of inscription. So this is clearly one of the most popular uses of writing on unperishable materials. Actually, one could argue that the title that I chose for the talk is a bit misleading, because we're not dealing with the identifying inscriptions in the beginnings of alphabetic Greek as a whole, but in the beginnings of visible alphabetic writing. We have evidence that suggests that perishable materials were being used at least from the 7th century BC, if not earlier. And so we have to bear in mind that these documents that I am analyzing here are and were meant to be written on unperishable materials. To give you a hint of the kinds of materials where we found these inscriptions, here's a chart that shows the data retrieved from this database. A minority of them are found on very valuable materials like gold or silver, and of course the most popular material is clay. But I have to say that this category includes objects that range from the most elaborated artistic vases to very modest objects such as loom weights and Astoreca. And if we take a look at the text that we find in these inscriptions, we can find some common elements within this variety of texts. The most evident is the inclusion of formulas repeated among texts of a similar nature. So we can see names in the genitive case, with or without the verb to be, as an indication of ownership. We've seen some of those today. I am next to stop, I'm stop, whatever. We also have signatures of artisans, indicating who made or painted an object. Please note that there is no difference between saying that someone painted or wrote something. In some cases, it is clear that This statement refers to a painter, but when no painter is involved, we assume that it refers to the writer of that specific inscription. We have a variety of votive formulas as well, found on vases and statues dedicated in sanctuaries. There are also some erotic inscriptions related to the well-known erotic practices between males of the elite that can be either gentle or more obscene. Sorry about the obscene translation, but I wanted to be faithful to the original intention. And we also have epitaphs and memorials that follow a standard formula indicating that the reader is in front of someone's memorial. And these formulas are actually seen all across the Greek-speaking world, as you can see in this map, which suggests that already in the first 2 centuries of visible writing, these practices are widespread and well established among Greek-speaking populations. Some of these studies that have come out in recent years have looked specifically at the socio-cultural context in which these inscribed objects and their texts are embedded. Thus, Papadopoulos looked at the role of pottery workshops and artisans in the early stages of the spread of writing, given the big amount of clay vessels that bear inscriptions, some of them referring to the making of the object, as I just mentioned. Wekowski analyzed these objects from a different point of view and was able to reconstruct how some texts, specifically ownership statements and erotic inscriptions, would play a part in the games happening at the symposium and the role of aristocratic dynamics in the spread of visible writing. Whereas Boroyanis argues that it is sanctuaries and the religious and trading activities practiced in them what explains better the emergence and transmission of these writing practices. I believe that these arguments should not be taken as exclusive, but as complementary, or each of them explains a portion of these inscriptions, or even different stages that one of these inscribed objects could have gone through. What I would like to analyze here, however, are the common elements in these inscriptions and the functions that can be identified, no matter the context or contexts where these were present. So from a linguistic point of view, it is worth mentioning that all the formulas place the name of the individual in the linguistic focal point of the sentence, which in ancient Greek is at the beginning. Therefore, the focus of the text is the individual rather than the object. This suggests that the intention behind the inscription is not as much the tagging of the object as it is the identification of the person mentioned. Take, for example, this inscription that you've already seen today on this very small lekitos. It is a simple ownership statement with a curse attached to it. In this case, and also in those other objects where we just find the first part, the ownership statement, the meaningful part, according to my analysis, is not that the object is a lekitos owned by Natalia, but that Natalia is in fact the owner of that lekitos. And in this case, this is evidently reinforced by the curse for the stealer. This is not to say that the object is not of any value within the writing practice. And in fact, we could actually see a symbiotic relationship between object and individual. The object, inscribed or not inscribed, enables the participation of the individual in the social practices that I have mentioned earlier. But this participation is enhanced by the identifying text, both in the level of the object and the individual. In the case of the object, it makes it stand out among other non-inscribed objects that can be found within the same context and probably increases its value. As per the individuals mentioned, there was surely some sort of prestige attached to the contribution with this kind of special object that also records their participation in the activity. Not to mention that this was probably evidence that they had the ability to write, which was clearly well considered, judging from the existence of identifying inscriptions that claim authorship, and also the dedication of abecedaries in sanctuaries. Or, well, in case they did not write the text themselves, this identification shows at least that they had the means to commission it. There is also a connection happening between the individual and the object that is happening through the text, a relationship that is absent in the case of uninscribed objects. The object is providing the person with an ideal support for the expression of their identity. We must not forget that we are talking about unperishable materials and that the authors or commissioners of these texts were aware of these characteristics. The fact that the text cannot get lost or be modified unless the object is destroyed makes it a token of their identity that works across time and space. Even if the person is not present in the social context that were mentioned before in that moment, the record of their previous participation is permanent. In return, what the individual is offering to the object through the text is uniqueness, making the object recognizable as well. The mention of the individual is also providing a sense of humanity, as Professor Wheatley has argued before, reinforced by the appearance of that personal name in the focal position. All of this is possible thanks to the identifying text that the object is bearing. And so the effective identification of the individual mentioned becomes basic in this writing practice. I would like to explain briefly how this identification is made beyond the incorporation of a personal name in the text. At first sight, one might identify specific shapes and signs that belong to a specific local alphabet. In Greece, there were almost as many local alphabets as there were cities, and their existence allows the straightforward recognition of the place of origin of text, its writer or its commissioner. As pointed out by Lurabi, these scripts were employed in multiple occasions as markers of a cultural or political identity. In some cases, it would not be difficult, even for people with very low levels of literacy, to identify some of these concrete typographic characteristics in the text. A good example of this would be Nicandra's sculpture, which has an inscription running along her dress in the right-hand side. And the most characteristic element of the script in this inscription is the digraph for the Naxian sign. A digraph that is not shared with any other Greek alphabet, thus identifying Nicandre and her family as Naxians, even if you are not able to read the whole text. And this, despite of using Parian marble for a dedication made in the sanctuary of Delos. The fact that the digraph appears precisely in the word Naxian makes it even more remarkable. Perhaps it would be worth exploring in the future whether, in this case, the fact that Psi is present in the demonym contributes to the creation or attachment to specific graphic signs. It is evident that the sanctuary of Delos, that very tiny island marked in red, Delos would have been a place where the local alphabets contributed to the identification of the offerer. There one can find numerous votives from the nearby islands, and mainly Paros and Naxos. And with this situation in mind, the special traits would be a way to record and tell apart the dedication made by parents and those left by Naxians. The latter are recognizable by their digraphs, while the Parians had a very unusual way to write down their O sounds. What we would think is an omega is used actually for the short O, while the Omicron shape is used for a long open O, exactly the opposite as the Ionic script that will become the standard alphabet for Greek centuries later. I wonder whether this suggests that there was some sense of competition among citizens of these two islands to show which had a bigger presence in the sanctuary, and that their scripts would be some way to account for this. Another element to take into account when thinking about the identification or cultural identification of individuals are dialectal features. The perception of these features is not as straightforward and visual as the local alphabets in some cases, and it would require a higher level of literacy to recognize them. So if we compare Nicandra's votive text with that of Manticlos, another quite famous inscription, this one coming from the ocean, we can see some of these dialectal features. They start in an almost identical fashion with their names plus the votive formula, and they already differ in the epithet, far shooting. In Manticlos' case, that's referring to Apollo, and in the case of Nicandre, to his twin, the goddess Artemis. And we can see that while in Nicandre's Cycladic dialect, it is spelled out as Pekeboloi or Pekeboloi, we're still not very sure about that. Manticlos, the ocean, says Wekaboloi, keeping the initial digamma and a long alpha where Cycladic has eta. Also, Nicandra's own name is tied to the characteristics of her dialect. For in other dialects, Nicandra is attested in later inscriptions, same as Casignete is actually Casigneta in other dialects. But the short inscriptions are not exempt of a dialectal differentiation. Even in the most simple ownership formula, well, most simple will be just the name, but the second one, so I am of whoever, the verb amy appears written with epsilon iota, or only epsilon, or eta, depending on the results of phonetic processes in each of the dialects. The same happens in the memorials, where we can find either sama or sema, depending on the dialect. So as you can see, the identification of dialectal feature is mainly enabled by vowels, which takes us back to Powell's theory on the systematic use of vowel signs. These signs do not show successfully vowel length in many cases, but they do bear a lot of linguistic information that is in fact vital to recognize proper name accurately. Well, I have already mentioned, for example, that the name Nicandre has a form Nicandra in other dialects, and without that final vowel, it would not have been possible to see the dialectal nuance. Similarly, there is a male name, Nicandros, that in some cases of its declension can also be differentiated from the feminine just with a vowel. Therefore, these vowels have not only phonetic but also dialectal and morphological information, basic to identify the person mentioned. But most importantly, vowels have semantic information. This means that sometimes two words with distinct meaning can only be recognized with a vowel. In Greek, this happens, for example, if we take the forms of the verbs archomai, to be ruled, and erchomai, to come. They can only be differentiated with the first vowel. And the same is also applicable to names. Nicandre's husband, Phraxos, could have been easily mistaken for another name, Phrixos, if it were not for that alpha. But there is only one inscription that has ever been interpreted as a Greek personal name written without the vowels. This cup found in Eretria is clearly Semitic in the style of the cup and the writing, and the sequence of the letters KPLS has not been identified as a Semitic word or text. I would like to think that it should be, in fact, a Semitic text, but some wanted to propose that it would be a Greek name, with the idea that a Greek person could know how to write in the West Semitic script, and decided to write down his name in that way. The only attested name that could be close to a match is Capellas, with double lambda. That's not very convincing. But what has been proposed instead is an unattested proper name, Capellos, based on the noun meaning retail dealer or tavern keeper. Although the explanation is far-fetched, let us think for a moment that it could be possible. In that case, what is stopping us from reading instead its female form Capellis? Unless the reader knows beforehand, there is no reason to discard one over the other. The point that I want to make with this exercise of imagination is that if we have to argue for a reason why vowel signs are consistently used in alphabetic Greek writing, it is clearly not because of the length of the vowels or the rhythm of the verse, but because of the vital amount of information that these vowels carry in them. And this is especially obvious when we analyze these instances of personal names. Well, I probably went too far into the linguistic side of these inscriptions in this last bit, but I hope to have shown that by deepening the linguistic study and by combining it with analysis of the context, it is possible to offer a different view on the functions and uses of writing, in this case applied to early Greek alphabetic writing. This was just a small case study with a very specific kind of inscription in mind, and it would be interesting to explore the similarities and differences with other types of texts. Today we saw that what could be interpreted as one of the most popular uses of writing in the first 2 centuries of visible writing in alphabetic Greek. These practices seem to have in common the desire to identify individuals as authors, makers, owners, offerers, lovers, and deceased loved ones. These proper names remind us, thousands of years later, that there are real humans behind these inscriptions, something that we seem to overlook sometimes. And by paying attention to the relationship between the text and the individuals mentioned in them, and how this interaction is enabled by the materiality and linguistic elements of the inscription, we might understand a bit better both the role of these inscribed objects and their text in their social context, but also the nature of the writing system that they support. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Natalia.